3 antique keys, a leather folder with a dead queen's crest on it, and one sentence from a lawyer that erased 15 years of quiet certainty in a single morning. Camilla's son had asked him to read the fourth line again, and by the time he did, Prince William wasn't even looking at the document anymore. He was holding out those 3 keys, not offering them, taking them back, and nobody at that table moved. Not Camilla, not her children, not even King Charles, who had spent years letting one very dangerous assumption settle over this family like dust. The assumption that a 12,000-acre estate would one day belong to Camilla's side. Except, the lawyers had just confirmed something brutal. It didn't belong to them now, it never had. And that wasn't even the part that made the king lower his eyes. That was buried on the final page under the signature of a man everyone in that room had completely forgotten. Hit subscribe before we get into this one, because the way it unravels is one of the cleanest pieces of legal chess I've ever walked through, and the twist at the end is genuinely something. I'm Harold, and on this channel, I take the stories that arrive as one clean headline and I pull them apart to show you the machinery underneath. The paperwork, the timelines, the quiet moves nobody was supposed to notice. And by the end of this one, you'll understand something the headline can't tell you. That this was never really a fight over a house. It was a fight over control. And it was won years before anyone in that room even knew there'd be a battle. Let me set the scene, because the how of that morning tells you everything. 3 hours before those keys came off the table, Camilla's family had arrived expecting a private formality, not an argument, not a confrontation, paperwork. Because the estate, let's call it by its name, Ravensmere, had been treated as settled business for the better part of 15 years. And we're not talking about a cottage. 12,000 acres, a Jacobean manor, 42 cottages, 2 working farms, a private lake, paintings that had never once appeared in any public inventory. And here's the detail that tells you how settled everyone thought this was. The staff had started referring to one of the upstairs rooms as Mr. Parker Bowles' study. That morning, someone had put fresh flowers in it. Fresh flowers in a room they'd already mentally handed over. Hold that image, because by sunset, those flowers would be carried back out. And then William arrived, and I want you to notice how he arrived, because it was the first warning and nobody read it. No motorcade, no announcement, one dark vehicle through the eastern gates at 8:46 in the morning. And he wasn't alone. 2 solicitors stepped out behind him, each carrying an identical black document case. That's the second warning. But here's the third, and it's the one that should have emptied the room of oxygen if anyone had understood it. William refused to enter through the main doors. He walked around the side of the house, across the wet gravel courtyard, and let himself in through the old estate office, the room where the land records had been kept since the reign of Queen Victoria. And you have to ask yourself, why would the Prince of Wales ignore the drawing room, ignore the family, and walk straight to the records? And the answer is the whole story. Because this was never a family meeting. It was an execution, and he'd come to where the evidence was kept. Now, to understand why this landed like a bomb, you have to understand what Camilla's family genuinely believed and why they believed it. Because they weren't being greedy fantasists. They'd been told. By Nightingale, Camilla had been informed William was in the building, and reportedly she assumed he'd come to talk about renovations. And that assumption was completely reasonable, because there had been real talk of renovations. The East Wing needed structural work. 2 roofs were leaking. There had even been quiet conversations about converting several of the cottages for members of her extended family. and Charles, by accounts, had encouraged all of it. Not formally, and that word formally is going to matter enormously in a minute, but privately. In the way powerful families make promises when they're certain nobody will ever ask them to prove it. 5 words, apparently, that got said more than once. You'll always have Ravensmere. 5 harmless words. Except, here's the thing about harmless words. They stop being harmless the second someone starts spending money because they believe them. And they had. Plans had been drawn up. Furniture had been measured. One relative had reportedly already discussed moving a collection of horses onto the southern paddocks. Camilla's son had, by accounts, been walked through the wine cellar and told which bottles were considered part of the house. Now imagine hearing that year after year. Imagine being treated as the future owner every single time you drove through those gates. And then imagine William walking in, setting a 6-page legal opinion on the table and saying quietly, "None of you were ever beneficiaries." And that sentence doesn't just change the meaning. Think about what it actually does. It changes the past. Because suddenly, every one of those promises means something different. Every renovation becomes a question. Every room they'd started calling their own belongs to someone else. But to whom? That was the question hanging over the entire table, and it was the one question William refused for now to answer. And I want you to hold on to that phrase, "None of you were ever beneficiaries," because of how quietly brutal it is. He didn't say, "You've lost the estate." He didn't say, "I've decided to take it back." Both of those would have implied it had once been theirs to lose. He said, "were ever," past tense, reaching all the way back to before any of them had walked through the gates. In 4 words, he didn't just take the future, he rewrote the entire past 15 years into a misunderstanding. Years of being shown wine cellars and measuring furniture and calling a room the study, all of it recast in a single clause as a thing that had never had any legal footing at all. That's a colder blow than anger. Anger says, "You crossed me." What William said was, "There was never anything here." Camilla came into the estate office just after 9:20. Charles followed a few minutes later, and by accounts he was visibly irritated, not by the situation yet, but by the simple fact that this hadn't been brought to him first. And here's the first real tell of the power in that room. William didn't stand when his father entered. He stayed seated beside the lead solicitor, one hand resting on a faded leather folder. And Charles looked at that folder immediately because he recognized the crest on it. It belonged to his grandmother, the Queen Mother. And accounts say that's the exact moment the confidence drained out of his face. Because a man like Charles doesn't need the documents read to him to know what it means when his son turns up holding his grandmother's private papers. He already knew in his gut that he'd lost something. He just didn't yet know what. So here's what the folder actually contained. And this is where it stops being a family squabble and becomes something almost surgical. Ravensmere had not been bought by Charles. It had not been granted to Camilla, and this surprises people. It wasn't Crown Estate property either. It sat inside a private family settlement, a legal structure created decades earlier and then amended 3 separate times. And you have to follow the amendments because they're the trap. The First Amendment protected the land. The Second protected the house. But the Third Amendment protected the one thing nobody in that room had thought to check: the succession clause. The rule about who comes next. What Charles had in legal terms was something called a life interest. And let me explain that plainly because it's the hinge of everything. A life interest means you get to use a thing for the length of your life. Charles could live at Ravensmere. He could maintain it. He could take certain income from the farms, but, and here's the wall he walked straight into, he could not permanently transfer it outside the bloodline named in the settlement. Not by promise, not by letter, not even by royal command. He had the keys to the house for his lifetime. He never had the right to decide who got it after him. And he had been promising exactly that for 15 years. And then Camilla's daughter asked the obvious, reasonable question, the one you're probably asking right now. If the king controls it during his lifetime, why can't he choose what happens to it afterward? And a solicitor opened the folder and gave the answer that turned the temperature in that room to ice, because that choice was removed before his marriage, not after the wedding, before it. Somebody had anticipated this exact fight, Charles marrying Camilla, Camilla's family drifting toward the estate, and had shut the door on it years before anyone else even realized there was going to be a door. And of course, the whole room assumed the name behind that was Queen Elizabeth. Everyone looked at William, waiting for him to say the late Queen's name, and he didn't, because it wasn't her. The amendment had been signed in 1999, 3 years before the Queen Mother died, 6 years before Charles married Camilla, and next to the Queen Mother's signature was a second one, Princess Margaret's, and now the room wasn't just tense, it was personal, because anyone who knew this family knew exactly who Margaret was. Sharp-eyed, suspicious, fiercely, almost ferociously protective of family property. And according to the documents, Margaret had raised a very specific concern that Ravensmere could one day pass through a marriage into a family the original settler had never named. She didn't accuse anyone she didn't need to. The wording did it for her, and it was cold enough to freeze the table. No spouse, no child of a spouse, and no descendant unrelated by blood to the line of King George VI shall acquire permanent title, controlling interest, or beneficial ownership. And sit with what that means for a second, because it's crueler than being named. Camilla's children weren't singled out by name in that clause. They were excluded as a category, as a type of person, before the marriage that would connect them to the family had even happened. Two women in 1999 looked into the future, saw a family that didn't exist yet, and legislated it out of the inheritance in advance. That's not a squabble. That's foresight with a signature on it. And I keep coming back to the timing of that signature because it reframes the entire Margaret and Queen Mother relationship for me. Think about where the family actually was in 1999. Charles and Camilla weren't married. They weren't even publicly, formally a couple in the way they'd later become. The whole rehabilitation of that relationship in the public eye was still years away. So for two senior members of the family to sit down in 1999 and write a clause specifically designed to keep a future spouse's bloodline away from a family estate, they had to be reading the situation with absolutely ruthless clarity. They weren't reacting to something that had happened. They were preempting something they were certain would happen. And whatever you think of Margaret, and history has not always been kind to her, you have to admit that is a chillingly accurate long-range read of exactly how this family would drift over the next quarter century. She saw the estate quietly sliding toward the Parker Bowles orbit before there was even a marriage to slide through, and she shut the road before it was built. People love to talk about William's foresight in these stories, but William was only finishing a move his great-aunt started when he was a teenager. And here's the human weight underneath all that cold legal language, because it's easy to read protect the bloodline as pure snobbery. And I don't think that's all it was. These old family settlements exist because houses like this one aren't really owned by the person living in them. They're held in trust on behalf of a line. The whole idea is that you are a custodian, not an owner. The house passes through you to the children of the blood, and your job is to hand it on intact. So when Margaret drew that line, she wasn't just being possessive. She was, in her own severe way, protecting the claim of children who hadn't been born yet. The George, the Charlotte, the Louis of a generation she'd never meet. And that, more than anything, is why William couldn't let it go. Because the people that clause was ultimately protecting were his own children. This was never abstract for him. It was his kid's birthright sitting in a folder with someone else's furniture being measured into it. And then Charles leaned toward the solicitor and said the thing that I think he genuinely believed: "I was never informed of this." And William finally looked at his father and delivered the first real blow. "You signed acknowledgement of it." And a photocopy went onto the table. And there it was. Charles's own signature at the bottom, dated November 1999. The King of the United Kingdom staring at his own name on the very document that had just dismantled 15 years of his private promises. He turned the page over, looked at the date again, looked at William, and for several seconds, by every account, he had nothing to say at all. But the solicitor did. And this is where I actually feel for Charles a little, because it explains how a smart man walks into this. The acknowledgement Charles signed in 1999 hadn't been presented as, "Here is the clause that stops your future wife's family from ever inheriting." It had been attached to a much broader financial restructuring involving 6 different properties, and Ravensmere appeared in it only twice. Once by a dry legal parcel number, and once under an older name for the estate that hadn't been used publicly since 1936. So Charles may genuinely have signed it without ever registering what that one clause meant. Or he may have understood it perfectly well and simply told himself it could be changed later. Nobody can see inside the man's head in 1989. But watch what he did over the following years, because his actions point hard at that second version. Because here's the thing, the clause could be changed. That's the part Camilla's family had been quietly counting on the whole time. All Charles needed was the consent of the surviving trustees. And by now, there was only one surviving trustee whose approval actually mattered: Prince William. And now you understand why he walked in holding those keys. He wasn't a guest at this meeting. He was the gate. And Charles had already tried the gate months earlier. Not directly, that would have looked too obvious. But a palace aide had reportedly sent William a proposal describing the future of Ravensmere as a continuity arrangement. Continuity. What a beautiful, soft word for making a private promise permanent. And William asked one question in reply: who receives the beneficial interest? The real one, who actually ends up owning the value here. And the answer came back 2 days later. A new family trust would be created, and its beneficiaries would include Camilla's children and grandchildren. And William wrote one word in the margin and sent it back: rejected. But Charles didn't stop. And the second attempt was cleverer, genuinely clever. This time, Camilla's family wouldn't own Ravensmere at all. On paper, the estate would stay inside the royal settlement. Instead, they'd simply receive a 99-year lease at a nominal rent of $1 a year. Do you see the move? Technically, nothing leaves the bloodline. Practically, William and his own children are locked out of that house for a century. It's ownership in everything but the word. And it was almost clever enough, except the two women who wrote that 1999 amendment had thought of leases too. Any agreement longer than 21 years required unanimous trustee approval, which meant it still had to go through William, and he rejected that one as well. And I want to pause on those two rejected proposals for a second, because taken together, they tell you something important about how this fight was really being fought. Not with shouting, but with structure. Look at the escalation in cleverness. The first proposal was almost naive. Just create a trust and name Camilla's children as beneficiaries. Blunt, obvious. It walks straight into the 1999 wall, and William swats it in one word. But the second proposal is the work of someone who had actually read the amendment and gone looking for the gap. A 99-year lease at £1 a year. That's a genuinely sophisticated move because on paper it respects every rule. The bloodline keeps the title, nothing is transferred. It's just rented for a century to people who could never own it. Someone on Charles's side had studied the trap and tried to tunnel under it. And that's what tells you this wasn't a misunderstanding. You don't accidentally engineer a 99-year workaround to a clause you didn't know existed. The second proposal is proof that somebody knew exactly what the 1999 amendment said and was trying to defeat it anyway. And the fact that the Queen Mother's amendment had already closed the lease loophole that any agreement over 21 years needed unanimous trustee approval, that's the moment I really understood what those two women built in 1999. They didn't just write a rule, they anticipated the specific ways a future king would try to get around the rule, and they blocked those two in advance. A direct transfer? Blocked. A trust? Blocked. A long lease dressed up as a rental? Blocked. It's like they war-gamed every move Charles would eventually make and left a counter move waiting for each one, sealed in a folder for 26 years. That is not ordinary estate planning. That is someone who understood exactly what was coming and refused to let sentiment beat structure, and that should have been the end of it. 2 rejections. A clear no, but 3 weeks later contractors showed up at Ravensmere. Not for the leaking roofs, for a private residential survey. They measured the west wing, inspected the kitchens, assessed whether the old nursery corridor could be turned into self-contained family apartments, and nobody told William. And here's the mistake. The one that turned a quiet disagreement into the morning we started with. The invoice for that survey was charged to an estate maintenance account that William now helps oversee. A payment of $18,400 tucked neatly between a roof repair and some agricultural drainage work. And it wasn't the amount that caught his eye. It was the description. Future occupancy adaptation. Future occupancy. By whom? Nobody had told the man who controlled the gate that the house was being adapted for someone to move in. And this is the moment the detective in William takes over. He pulled every recent invoice connected to the property, and he found the furniture order. Custom shelving, a temperature-controlled wine room, 2 bathrooms redesigned for private residence, and the delivery name on that order wasn't Charles. It wasn't Camilla. It was Parker Bowles. There it was in a supplier's paperwork. The family that legally could never own the house having furniture built into it. And I want you to appreciate the significance of that because a survey and a furniture order might sound like small, dry things. They are not. They are evidence of intent. You do not build a temperature-controlled wine room and redesign bathrooms for private residence in a house you are planning to visit occasionally. You do that in a house you are planning to live in. So the paperwork didn't just embarrass anyone, it documented a plan. A quiet, methodical, expensive plan to turn Ravensmere into a lived-in family home. For people, the 1999 amendment had barred from ever owning it, and it did it in their own supplier's handwriting. Here's a rule I've learned covering these stories: the family conversation is always deniable because it happens in rooms with no records. But the money is never deniable. The money leaves a trail. And somebody had run that plan straight through an account with William's name on the oversight. They didn't just make a move, they made it on the one board he was watching. And I think that's the detail that tipped this from a disagreement into an execution. Because up to that point, William could have told himself this was all just optimistic talk. Assurances, dreams, harmless. The furniture order took it out of the realm of talk. It made it real, and it made it documented. And once it was documented, his hands were, in a sense, tied. A trustee who sees trust money being spent to benefit non-beneficiaries and does nothing has failed the trust. So the very thing designed to quietly cement Camilla's family into the house is the thing that legally forced William to move against it. They didn't just tip their hand, they handed him his obligation. Now, before we get to what William did with all that, let me bring in something from last week because a lot of you are going to feel the rhyme. Last week, I walked through how King Charles closed the very last door on Prince Harry, stripped his final royal privilege, made him ask permission to enter his own family's homes. And so many of you said the same thing in the comments, that this reign keeps coming down to Charles making private promises the paperwork won't let him keep. Well, here it is again from the completely opposite direction. With Harry, Charles was closing a door. Here, Charles was trying to hold one open for Camilla's side and ran into the exact same wall. The promise of the father colliding with the rules of the house. It is, I'm telling you, the defining pattern of this whole reign. So, back in the estate office, Camilla argued the reasonable defense that nobody had actually seized anything. The surveys were preliminary. The furniture wasn't installed, no lease had been signed, and all of that was technically true. But William wasn't accusing them of theft. He was doing something quieter and far more devastating. He was proving they had prepared to inherit something they had no legal right to receive. And when Camilla's son pushed the folder away, he said, "We acted on assurances." And William answered, "Assurances are not ownership." And everybody in that room knew exactly who had given those assurances: Charles. So when the king turned to his son and said this could have been handled privately, William had him. "It was private," he replied, "until money from the estate was used." And that's the point Charles could not brush away, and it's worth understanding why. Because it's the legal spine of the whole thing. Royal families survive almost anything through silence. Embarrassment, scandal, feuds. Silence absorbs it all. But financial records don't care about silence. The moment trust money, money belonging to that protected family settlement, was spent preparing the property for future occupants who were not beneficiaries, William didn't just have a grievance. He had a duty to challenge it. That was his legal footing, and it was solid. But Camilla reportedly saw something underneath it that frightened her more than the estate itself. Because if William was willing to dig through one forgotten leather folder over one property, what about all the others? These old family settlements govern more than Ravensmere, and a man who reads the fine print on one is a man who might read it on all of them. That's the moment her whole approach changed. She stopped arguing about who owned it, and she asked the other question: Who inherits instead? And this is where William stops being the prosecutor, and the real twist begins to open. So stay with me because the sequence here is beautiful. The fourth page was read aloud. Upon the end of Charles's life interest, the estate passes to the next eligible beneficiary named by the trustees, and Camilla's daughter jumped in. That's William. And she was right. It should have been William. Except 9 days earlier, quietly telling no one, William had formally renounced his own personal claim to Ravensmere. Nobody in that room knew. Not Charles, not Camilla, not even most of the palace. And here's the question that stops you cold. Why would a man fight this hard to protect an estate and then refuse to inherit it himself? And I'll be honest, this is the point where I'm reading his intentions rather than quoting them, because William has never explained his reasoning out loud. But watch what the renunciation actually does, because his actions say it plainly. He didn't want the house. He wanted control over what happened to it. And by renouncing his own claim, he did something surgical. He activated a clause that had been sitting dormant in that settlement for 27 years. With William out, the estate passes to the next sibling named in the Queen Mother's amendment. And now the chain starts moving. Watch the chain move, because it's like a row of doors closing one after another, and each one is its own little story. Harry? No. Harry's name was never included in this particular settlement at all, so the line skips straight past him. Princess Anne, she was included. But Anne had declined the succession years earlier in a sealed declaration filed long before any of this blew up. And that honestly is so perfectly, and it makes me smile. The one member of the family who wanted nothing, who'd quietly stepped out of the running before there was even a prize to want, purely because she doesn't operate on acquisition. So Anne removes herself, which leaves for one genuinely awful second, Prince Andrew, and accounts say Charles physically registered this on his face. And you can imagine the horror of that half second, can't you? The whole point of this exercise was to protect the estate, to keep it clean, and the chain had just pointed at the single most compromised man in the entire family. For a moment, Charles must have thought the cure had turned out worse than the disease. And then the solicitor turned the page, because of course the 1999 architects, or the amendments that followed, had thought of that too. Andrew had already been removed from eligibility under a conduct provision, a clause that strips a beneficiary who withdraws from official royal duties. Given everything that's engulfed Andrew in recent years, that clause did exactly what such clauses are built to do. It closed the door on him automatically, no debate required. So Andrew was out. And with William having renounced, Harry never named, Anne having declined, and Andrew disqualified, the row of doors had closed all the way down to exactly one man left standing, Prince Edward. And that is when Camilla's son said, read that again, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, the quiet one, the brother nobody in that room had thought about once all morning, would become the beneficial successor to Ravensmere. But even that isn't the full reveal. And this is the part that genuinely rearranges the whole story. Because Edward had already been informed weeks earlier, and he had already quietly accepted. No public victory, no gloating, no demand to go inspect the bedrooms. He accepted on one condition, and the condition is the twist. Ravensmere would never become his private family home. Instead, its farms, its cottages, its entire annual income would be placed into a new charitable foundation supporting veterans, bereaved military families, and young people leaving the care system. The manor itself would become a residential retreat for the families of service members, going through long-term medical treatment. Read that back. Edward inherited the estate and then gave away almost everything it could ever earn him. And that is the thing nobody at that table had prepared for, because they had all been braced for the wrong story. They thought they'd lost Ravensmere to a greedy prince. They hadn't. They'd lost it to a man who refused to treat it as personal property at all. And I need you to see why that condition is so quietly, devastatingly brilliant. Because on the surface, it looks like simple decency. And it is decency, but it's also the most complete checkmate in the entire story. Think about it from Camilla's family's position. If Edward had taken Ravensmere as his own private estate, they could resent him. They could whisper that one prince had simply outmaneuvered them for a prize, that it was ambition dressed up as legality, that the whole thing was just a richer, cleverer relative grabbing the house first. There'd be a story to tell, a villain to point at, but you cannot resent a veteran's charity. You cannot whisper that a man was greedy when he took a 12,000-acre inheritance and immediately routed its entire income to bereaved military families and kids aging out of the care system. Edward didn't just win the house, he made it impossible to be the villain for winning it. He removed in a single condition the one weapon the other side had left, the ability to cast him as the aggressor. That's not just kind, that's strategically airtight kindness. And those are very rare, and here's what it did to the optics of everything that came before, which is the part that must have burned. Because now the two versions of the family sit side by side permanently on the same land. On one side, a plan for a temperature-controlled wine room, redesigned bathrooms, custom shelving, a study with fresh flowers, and a brass nameplate. An inheritance measured out in comfort. On the other, cottages restored for veterans. A manor turned into a retreat for the families of the sick. An income signed away before anyone could even accuse him of wanting it. Every single family that will ever drive through those gates for help becomes a silent comparison, not stated, never stated. This family doesn't state things, but felt permanently by everyone who knows the story. That's the humiliation Charles saw coming the instant the solicitor finished reading. Not that he'd lost a house, that he'd lost it in a way that would quietly indict him. Every day it stayed a charity, and that reframes every single thing they'd done. Because now every restored cottage, every family driven through those gates becomes a quiet monument to the fact that while one side of the family was measuring bedrooms and building wine rooms, Edward turned an entire inheritance into service. Charles understood it instantly. The estate he'd privately promised to Camilla's side would now carry his brother's name through a public foundation forever. There is no more complete way to be shown that your assurance meant nothing. And I keep circling back to the sheer patience of what William actually did here, because it's the opposite of how we imagine a prince throwing his weight around. He didn't storm in and declare anything. He renounced his own claim first, 9 days early, in silence, telling no one. Which meant that by the time he sat down at that table, he wasn't taking the house for himself. He'd already given up the one thing that could have made him look like the aggressor. So he arrives at the meeting with clean hands, holding a folder, and lets the documents do every ounce of the work. He never even had to raise the possibility of Edward. The clause did it. The renunciation triggered it. All William supplied was the reading. That's a man who understood that the most unanswerable form of power is the kind where you're not the one making the decision. You've just arranged the machinery so the decision makes itself. Nobody can accuse you of ambition when your name isn't even on the prize. He didn't win the house, He made sure the right person won it and then stepped completely out of the frame. And then William slid the keys across the table, not toward Camilla, toward Edward's solicitor. 3 of them. The oldest opened the archive room where all of this had been hiding. The second opened the manor. And the third opened a tiny chapel near the northern boundary of the estate, a place, according to the final page, that Edward had visited exactly once as a boy with his grandmother. And notice which key went where in that gesture, because even the order of them was a message. The archive key first, the room full of documents, the room that had just won the entire fight, then the manor, and only last, almost as an afterthought, the little chapel. The house that had consumed 15 years of scheming came third in a man's priorities behind the records and behind a memory. That's the whole difference between the 2 sides of this family in a single handful of brass. One side had been measuring the bedrooms. The winner barely cared about them at all. And that chapel was the only part of all 12,000 acres Edward intended to keep for his own family. Not to live in, to remember her. The one man who took the whole estate wanted only the smallest, quietest corner of it. And only for a memory. Someone asked me in the comments a while back how a modern royal can possibly lose control of something without a single vote, a single headline, a single public act. And this is the answer. This exact scene, this is how power actually moves in a family like this, not in a throne room. In a records office, over a leather folder, with 3 keys sliding across a table toward a solicitor. No cameras, no announcement, just paperwork, decades old, doing precisely what it was written to do. If you ever wondered why these families obsess over documents that seem impossibly dry, this is why. The document is the weapon. Everything else is just the room it goes off in. And finally, Charles spoke. "You arranged all of this without coming to me." And William's answer was almost gentle. "You had already made your arrangement." And that is the humiliation. And it's a precise one, so let me name it exactly. Charles wasn't defeated by a rebellion. Nobody rose up against him. He was defeated by his own paperwork, by a signature he'd forgotten in 1999, by promises he never had the legal power to keep, and by a younger brother who took the prize and then stripped it of every ounce of personal value before anyone could so much as accuse him of ambition. You cannot even resent Edward for it. That's the genius of it. Camilla had one last question, and it's the saddest one in the whole meeting. What happens to the rooms already prepared? And the solicitor closed the folder and answered, "They'll be returned to the estate inventory." The custom shelving would come out. The private study designation would quietly disappear. The wine collection would be left untouched, but it was no longer anyone's in that family. And even the fresh flowers, the ones placed in Mr. Parker Bowles's study that very morning, were carried back out before sunset. By evening, the brass nameplate on that upstairs door had been unscrewed. And I think that little brass plate might be the saddest object in the whole story because someone had ordered it. Someone had engraved it. Someone had screwed it to that door believing it would stay there for a generation. A nameplate is confidence you can hold in your hand, and it came off in an afternoon. And here's what I find so telling about how this family operates. No announcement came. No palace statement corrected 15 years of quiet assumption. Anyone driving past the gates that week saw nothing unusual at all. The whole thing happened in total silence, the way everything real in that family happens. No press call, no statement of correction, just a quiet reversal executed room by room, so smoothly that the outside world never even knew there had been anything to reverse. But inside the manor, one small thing had changed. The keys no longer hung beneath Charles's portrait, where they'd always hung. They'd been placed in a plain wooden box next to a photograph of the Queen Mother, the woman who'd started all of this in 1999, and a handwritten note from Edward. 7 words: "Let this house belong to those who need it." And there's something almost circular about where those keys ended up, isn't there? They started the morning hanging beneath Charles's portrait, the symbol of a man who believed the house was his to promise away. They ended it in a plain wooden box beside a photograph of the Queen Mother, the woman who, from beyond the grave and through a clause written in 1999, had just proven it never was. The keys went from the living king who thought he controlled the house back to the dead queen who actually did. That's the whole story in one image. The past didn't just win, it was always going to win. It had simply been waiting in a box for the day someone finally opened the folder and read it out loud. So let me leave you with the question I keep turning over. Who actually won that morning? Was it William, who gave up the house to seize the control? Was it Edward, who took the inheritance and immediately gave it away? Or was it 2 women in 1999, a queen and a princess, who saw a family that didn't exist yet and locked the whole future shut with a single cold sentence 26 years before anyone opened the folder? And spare a thought genuinely for Charles in all of this, because I don't think he's the villain here. And the story is sadder if you don't flatten him into one. Picture it from inside his life. He spent decades fighting to be with Camilla through scandal, through public hatred, through a rehabilitation that cost him more than most people will ever understand. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he made her family a promise. Not a scheme, a promise. "You'll always have Ravensmere." He probably meant it as an act of love, a way of telling the family he'd married into that they truly belonged, that they were safe, that they were home. The tragedy is that he never had the power to make that promise true. He was a life tenant handing out deeds, a custodian pretending to be an owner. And the cruelest thing about the whole morning is that his own signature from 1999 was there to prove it.